In the book and later the movie Moneyball, the Oakland Athletics professional baseball team has a problem. Well, technically they have several problems, but the largest one is money. And where baseball's traditional ideas about talent might be shaped by habit, aesthetics, reputation, or occasionally reasoning that feels as though it was developed during a particularly strange fever dream. That is the basic conflict Moneyball gives us. On one side, experience, intuition, tradition, and the accumulated wisdom of people who have spent their lives around the game. On the other, data, probabilities, and the deeply irritating suggestion that some of the accumulated wisdom might not survive contact with hard evidence. The Athletics began challenging some of the statistics baseball had historically treated as important. Instead, they focused more heavily on things like on-base percentage because at that particular moment, the market was not fully valuing a player's ability to avoid making outs. And avoiding outs is helpful because technical baseball insight incoming, you only get 27 of them. So it's important to use them wisely. But the real innovation was not simply discovering one magical statistic. On-base percentage was valuable because other teams were undervaluing it. Oakland was looking for a gap between what the market believed a player was worth and what that player actually contributed to winning. And one of the interesting lessons here is that an advantage does not always come from having secret information. Sometimes everyone has access to roughly the same data, so the advantage comes from asking a better question, from recognizing that people have become attached to a proxy for success rather than the thing that they're actually trying to produce, from noticing that confidence, pedigree, familiarity, appearance, or a compelling story may be influencing judgment more than the evidence should allow. Of course, Moneyball is also a bit Hollywoodized. It gives us a suspiciously tidy conflict between old baseball men and Jonah Hill's laptop, and as with virtually everything, reality was messier. The lesson was never that statistics rendered scouts, coaches, and human judgment obsolete. Data could identify patterns. It could reveal where conventional wisdom was not supported by results. And it could help teams to compare players more systematically and expose biases people might not even realize they were applying. But baseball players are not collections of numbers wearing pants. They are humans. They develop, they get injured, they adjust or fail to adjust. Their mechanics change. They respond differently to coaching, pressure, failure, teammates, and environments. The strongest lesson from Moneyball is not that data should replace human judgment. It's that human judgment should be disciplined by evidence, and that evidence still has to be interpreted by people who understand what they're looking at. If every team begins valuing on-base percentage, players who got on base are no longer sitting quietly in the discount bin. The market adjusts, competitors adapt. The thing that differentiated you becomes something that everyone else is also doing. And now you have to find the next advantage. A model is not a permanent answer, especially when it comes to competitive advantage. It is an attempt to understand a particular environment at a particular moment using the information available at that time. Then the environment changes. The other side learns. People adjust their behavior. The metric becomes the target, and yesterday's innovation becomes tomorrow's minimum operating requirement. If you have not read the book or seen the movie, you may have guessed by now that Oakland's methods worked. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be talking about it on a podcast, and the book and movie likely would not have been released. The 2002 Athletics won 20 consecutive games and finished the regular season with 103 victories. 103. In baseball, that's a lot of wins over a 162-game season. Their process helped them to compete against teams with considerably more money. They identified overlooked value. They built a roster capable of succeeding across a long season. And then they lost a division series to the Minnesota Twins in 5 games. Welcome to the Unknown Knowns, where intuition meets tradecraft. I'm Dr. Angela Lewis, and this is a space for people who think for a living. Intelligence professionals, leaders, and decision makers navigating complexity, uncertainty, and imperfect information in a fast-paced world. Each week, we explore how intuition, bias, and judgment shape the way we make sense of complexity and how to get better at it. And this week, we're talking about baseball. Yes, baseball. You are still listening to the correct podcast. In baseball, there is an almost absurd amount of data. We can measure the velocity and movement of a pitch, the exact location where it crossed the plate, the hitter's launch angle, the speed of the ball off the bat, the probability that a particular ball will become a hit, how a batter performs against left-handed and right-handed pitchers, how often a pitcher throws a slider in a 2-strike count, how effective a defensive player is at reaching balls hit in different directions, how many runs a particular decision is expected to produce or prevent. We can study tendencies across seasons, games, at-bats, pitches, and fractions of movements that happen in less time than it takes most of us to realize the ball has left someone's hand. And after all of that, the game still has to be played by humans. The pitcher still has to execute, the hitter still has to recognize the pitch and decide whether to swing, the fielder still has to make the play, the manager still has to decide whether information gathered from hundreds or thousands of previous situations applies to the exact human beings on the field right now. All of that data can tell us what has happened, and it can help us to estimate what is likely to happen, but it cannot promise what will happen next. So this week, we're not so much talking about baseball statistics themselves, although we'll talk about some of those. And it's not about the idea that human judgment is magical and statistics should be ignored, which is how you end up making terrible decisions and then defending them with words like intangibles. This episode is about what happens when we do everything we reasonably can to prevent or improve an outcome, and the outcome remains uncertain anyway. So, back to Oakland. The Athletics used data to make better decisions. They identified skills the market was undervaluing. They found players who could help them to win without requiring the kind of payroll available to the Yankees. And across a 162-game season, those decisions accumulated into 103 victories. Now, to be fair, Oakland's 103 wins cannot be attributed entirely to one analytical philosophy. The team also had genuinely elite, conventionally recognizable talent, like Miguel Tejada, that year's American League MVP, and Barry Zito, that year's Cy Young winner, not to mention Tim Hudson, Mark Mulder, and Eric Chavez. This was not a controlled experiment, but the approach helped Oakland construct enough value around that talent to compete far above what its payroll should have allowed. That said, by almost any reasonable measure, the approach worked. And then, 5 games into the postseason, their season was over, which brings us to a distinction that sounds obvious but becomes remarkably difficult to maintain once we know how something turned out. Improving the probability of success is not the same thing as controlling the outcome. Over a long regular season, good decisions have time to accumulate. The sample size gets larger, talent and depth have repeated opportunities to matter. Some of the bizarre bounces, terrible calls, and evenings when no one can apparently remember how to hit a baseball begin to balance out. But in a 5-game series, a few bad pitches can really make a difference. One hitter getting hot matters, which means, of course, that one hitter turning into a human air conditioning unit also matters. An injury matters, a strange bounce matters, a judgment call matters. And a decision that succeeds 70% of the time could still fail at the worst possible moment. 70% is not 100%. No matter how personally offended we are by the remaining 30. Oakland used data to improve its odd, but it could not make the ending inevitable. That is not necessarily a failure of Moneyball, that's baseball. And it's part of why one of the movie's most memorable lines lands so beautifully. It's hard not to be romantic about baseball, because Moneyball could be understood as a story about stripping the romance out of the game, replacing intuition with numbers, replacing human stories with hard evidence, replacing the scout's eye with the analyst's model. But I think the story ultimately shows us something more complicated. The numbers help us to understand what is more likely. They can help us to recognize value, expose bias, allocate resources, and make better decisions. But they cannot fully tame the game. They cannot guarantee that a perfectly located pitch will not be hit. They cannot guarantee that a ball traveling more than 100 miles an hour will not go directly into somebody's glove. They cannot guarantee that the best team will win a short series. They cannot guarantee that the superstar will become the hero or that the player nobody expected much from will not become permanently etched into baseball lore. The data does not make baseball less human. It shows us how much effort, strategy, information, and preparation can go into improving an outcome while leaving the outcome stubbornly, maddeningly, beautifully uncertain. And I would argue that that is where the romance lives. And that tension exists at every level of the game. It begins with the individual player asking, what can I do to make success more likely, knowing I can never guarantee it? At the team level, the question expands. How do managers and front offices turn enormous amounts of information into decisions about rosters, matchups, pitching, and real-time strategy? How do they account for chemistry, confidence, leadership, adaptability, baseball IQ, and all of the other factors that may not fit neatly into a spreadsheet, but also cannot simply be dismissed as vibes or intangibles? And then there is the game itself, a living, adaptive system in which every decision changes the environment for the decision that comes next. So let's talk about Shohei Ohtani. Because if we're starting at the individual level, potentially the greatest baseball player of all time seems like a fairly obvious place to begin. Ohtani is a global superstar, an elite hitter and an elite pitcher occupying the same human body, despite more than a century of professional baseball suggesting that players were eventually supposed to pick a lane. He is so unusual that we regularly have to invent new statistical comparisons or reach all the way back to Babe Ruth to explain what we are seeing. Major League Baseball has even amended its designated hitter rules so that a starting pitcher who bats for himself can remain in the game as a designated hitter after leaving the mound, a change now commonly referred to as the Ohtani rule. But Ohtani did not simply appear one day fully formed as the possible GOAT. He is obviously extraordinarily talented. But talent is not an outcome, and potential by itself does not actually do anything. Potential has to be developed. It has to survive repetition, frustration, fatigue, injury, pressure, and countless days where the work is considerably less exciting than the dream. And Ohtani is certainly not the only major league player who understands this. Professional baseball players devote enormous amounts of time to structured physical training, film study, mental preparation, and relentless repetition of fundamentals. Teams employ mental skills coaches to help players manage confidence, pressure, focus, failure, and the psychological demands of a game in which even exceptional performers fail regularly. And even the best hitters in the world still hit baseballs off a tee, not because they have forgotten how batting works, but because simplifying the exercise allows them to isolate their setup, positioning, mechanics, and approach. The movement may eventually look effortless during the game, but that effortlessness is built through thousands of highly deliberate and often extremely unglamorous repetitions. Ohtani's approach is especially useful because it gives us a remarkably clear illustration of how someone can connect all that daily work to a much larger ambition. As a teenager, he completed a mandala-style goal chart as part of a broader developmental approach commonly associated with the Harada method. The Harada method was developed by Takahashi Harada while he was working with underperforming high school athletic teams in Japan. In a nutshell, it is a personal strategy framework. You begin with a long-term objective, identify the core capabilities that would make that outcome more likely, and then translate each of those capabilities into specific, repeatable behaviors. The chart does for an individual what a good strategy document should do for an organization. It connects the desired outcome to the systems, capabilities, and daily actions required to pursue it. In the center of his chart was an extraordinarily specific ambition: to be selected in the first round by 8 Japanese professional teams, a possibility under Japan's draft system in which multiple teams can name the same first-round player before a lottery determines who receives his negotiating rights. Surrounding that goal were the areas he believed would make it more likely, things like physical conditioning, pitch command, velocity, mental strength, character, and even what might be translated as luck or karma. Then he broke each of those areas down again into specific actions. The center contained the outcome. The outer boxes contained the work required to get there. Now, Ohtani's central goal depended partly on external variables that he didn't control. He could not control what every professional team needed. He could not control who else entered the draft or how talented they were. He could not control how each organization assessed potential and risk, which opportunities became available, or whether a decision maker happened to value exactly what he offered. But he could influence the probability that he would become the kind of player they wanted. He could improve his physical conditioning, develop his command and velocity, strengthen his mental preparation, and regulate his emotions. And he could become someone who cared for his teammates, treated people with respect, maintained his environment, and behaved like the kind of professional others would want to invest in. Some of the items on his chart seemed pretty ordinary. Pick up trash, clean up the room, greet people properly, read books, show respect. These were not direct instructions for throwing a better fastball or hitting a 110-mile-an-hour, 435-foot home run with a 29-degree launch angle. They reflected something broader. Ohtani was not only training baseball skills, he was deliberately constructing the habits, environment, reputation, and identity of the person he believed could perform consistently at the highest level. This connects closely to what James Clear calls identity-based habits in Atomic Habits. Clear distinguishes among changing an outcome, changing a process, and changing an identity. Rather than focusing on what you want to achieve, identity-based habits ask you to consider the kind of person you want to become, and then repeatedly behave in ways that provide evidence for that identity. You do not set the goal of reading more. You become someone who reads. You do not merely decide that you want to be a better leader. You repeatedly practice the behaviors of someone who listens, prepares, communicates clearly, and takes responsibility. And Ohtani did not merely decide he wanted to become an exceptional baseball player. He tried to define what that person did, how that person trained, how that person responded to pressure, how that person treated teammates, coaches, umpires, and strangers, what that person did when nobody was watching, and on a random Tuesday when the work was repetitive and he did not particularly feel like doing it. Ohtani was not merely asking, what do I want? He was asking, what would have to be true for that outcome to become more likely? Who would I need to become? And what would I need to do repeatedly for those conditions and that identity to exist? That is where ambition and goals become strategy. The chart did not guarantee that Ohtani would achieve the outcome in its center. No framework could do that. Talent, coaching, health, opportunity, competition, organizational decisions, and luck would all continue to matter. But it gave him a system for controlling what he could control. And that is the first major lesson that baseball offers about judgment under uncertainty. You cannot guarantee the outcome, but you can identify the conditions that make it more likely, translate those conditions into action, and repeatedly behave like the person capable of producing them. There's also the work of strategy in intelligence and leadership. A goal is not a strategy. Saying that a team needs to become more proactive, produce better analysis, or support stronger decisions describes an aspiration. Strategy requires leaders to work backward. What capabilities would make that outcome more likely? What systems need to exist? And what should people actually be doing differently on a random Tuesday? The leader's job is not to promise an outcome. It's to create the conditions, structures, and repeatable behaviors that improve the probability of achieving it. Now, Ohtani's chart is essentially a personal strategy document, but baseball is not an individual sport, despite the fact that at any given moment, it may look like one person standing alone on a mound trying to ruin another person's evening. At the team level, the problem becomes considerably more complicated. You are no longer designing a system around one player's development. You are managing a 26-player active roster drawn from a much larger organizational system. You're managing their health, workload, strengths, limitations, personalities, and development across a 162-game season, and longer if you make it to the postseason. You are preparing for opponents who are collecting information about you while you collect information about them. And then you are making decisions in real time as the conditions continue to change. Now, at this point, I should probably disclose that I am a Dodgers fan. I grew up rooting for the Cincinnati Reds, later adopted the Washington Nationals, and eventually found my way to Los Angeles. This is not because I'm fickle, although I recognize that a sports traditionalist might submit the preceding sentence as evidence. My allegiances tend to follow the humans behind the game. I become invested in compelling stories, extraordinary competence, resilience, and that particularly appealing combination of brilliance and basic human decency. I develop strong opinions about players and teams based on who they are or appear to be on and off the field. The Dodgers have given me quite a lot to work with. They also have become a particularly useful team through which to think about data, strategy, leadership, human judgment, and the occasional decision by Dave Roberts that causes millions of people to develop extremely strong opinions simultaneously. Because baseball has always been a game that counts things: hits, runs, errors, batting averages, earned run averages, pitcher wins, and over time, baseball analytics professionals began asking whether the things baseball traditionally counted were actually the best measures of performance. That broader movement became known as sabermetrics. Bill James coined the term in 1980, partly in honor of the Society for American Baseball Research, or SABR, and defined it as a search for objective knowledge about baseball. But the underlying idea is older than the term itself, and it sounds a little bit like baseball intelligence to me. Baseball thinkers have been using statistics to question conventional wisdom for decades, asking whether familiar measures actually captured the performance people believed they did. Sabermetrics is not one particular statistic. It's a way of thinking that asks a bit more of the data, whether we're actually measuring the things we care about or if we're measuring more convenient proxies and allowing tangential data to shape our perceptions. That's a pretty thought-provoking question for those of us who operate outside of baseball, too, especially in an age where AI makes understanding data provenance even more challenging. Are we measuring the thing we actually care about or allowing an accessible proxy to shape our understanding of it? Baseball gives us an unusually visible version of that challenge because StatCast now allows teams to measure aspects of performance that once lived primarily in the realm of the scout's eye. StatCast, which was implemented across all major league ballparks in 2015, has expanded from tracking pitches, batted balls, and player movement to measuring things like bat speed and swing paths, pitch velocity, spin rate, release point, horizontal and vertical movement, exit velocity, launch angle, bat speed, sprint speed, a fielder's initial reaction, the route taken to the ball, how much ground he covered, the probability that a catch should have been made, how quickly a catcher transferred and released the ball. Baseball has reached the point where it occasionally feels as though the only thing StatCast cannot measure is how personally offended I am when an outfielder jogs toward the ball instead of sprinting. Presumably, that metric is still under development. But all of that creates a new problem. When nearly everything can be measured, the challenge is no longer simply obtaining information. The challenge is determining which information matters. More data does not automatically produce more intelligence. Someone has to identify which indicators are relevant to the decision being made. Someone has to interpret what those signals and indicators mean. Someone has to distinguish a meaningful pattern from random variation. Someone has to recognize when large historical samples are more informative than what happened last night, and when something about the player or situation has changed enough that the historical data may no longer apply cleanly. And then someone has to translate all of that into something another human being can actually use. Because the front office, the manager, the coaching staff, and the player do not all have the same information requirement. The front office may be deciding whether to sign a player to a 10-year contract. The manager may be deciding whether to put him in the lineup against a particular pitcher. The hitting coach may be trying to diagnose why his swing path has changed over the past week. And the player may be standing in the on-deck circle with approximately 90 seconds before someone throws a baseball at him at 100 miles an hour. Handing all four of them the same 50-page analytical report would not be transparency. It would be a cry for help. This is one version of what intelligence professionals sometimes call the last mile problem. Value is created when the right information reaches the right person in a form that person can understand and use while there is still time for it to affect the decision. Baseball coaches have described this translation problem directly. The information may originate with analysts, but someone still has to convert it into the individual player's language. Otherwise, the information does not matter. The analyst may know the pitcher's slider has a particular movement profile and produces a high chase rate when it begins in a certain location. The hitter may need to hear, when he gets ahead in the count, the slider expands away. Don't chase it. That's not dumbing down the analysis, that's finishing the job. There's another important distinction here, the difference between base rate and the specific case. The base rate tells you what generally happens across a larger set of comparable situations. For example, maybe a particular hitter performs significantly worse against left-handed pitching, or a reliever has historically been effective against the next three batters, or maybe a certain kind of contact becomes a hit 7 times out of 10. But the manager still has to determine whether the player standing in front of him today is meaningfully different from the player represented in the historical data. The specific case. For example, is he injured or fatigued? Has his velocity declined? Has he changed his mechanics? Is the hitter seeing the ball unusually well? Is the sample size large enough to trust? Has the opposing team already recognized the same tendency and adjusted to it? The base rate should discipline judgment, but it can't fully replace it. The base rate is the starting point, not permission to stop thinking. And interestingly, modern metrics can even help teams separate the quality of the process from the result of a single play. StatCast's expected batting average, or XBA, estimates how likely a batted ball was to become a hit based on what happened to comparable balls with similar exit velocities and launch angles, and in some situations, the hitter's speed. A ball with an XBA of 700 becomes a hit in roughly 7 out of 10 comparable cases, which means it becomes an out 3 times out of 10. A hitter can make excellent contact and watch the ball travel directly into a perfectly positioned glove. Another hitter can make terrible contact, break his bat, and watch the ball flutter safely into shallow right field. The box score rewards the second hitter and punishes the first. The underlying data tells us more about the quality of the contact. That gives us one way to separate the quality of a process from the result it happened to produce. The same discipline matters when we evaluate decisions. It is the difference between an expected outcome and the actual outcome, and it matters because human beings are extremely prone to evaluating decisions backwards. Once we know whether a strategy worked, the result begins to feel as though it had always been foreseeable. If Dave Roberts brings in a reliever and the reliever escapes the inning, it was a shrewd matchup decision. If the same reliever allows a 3-run home run to lose the lead, millions of people immediately conclude that the decision was indefensible. The warning signs were obvious, and they personally would have managed the decision better from their couches. Outcome bias makes us confuse the quality of the result with the quality of the decision. And once we know the result, hindsight bias makes that result feel far more predictable than it actually was. But a sound decision can fail, and an unsound decision can succeed. This means a smart choice that ends in quote-unquote bad luck is sometimes unfairly labeled as foolish, while a reckless gamble that pays off by quote-unquote pure chance can sometimes be praised as wise. The relevant question then is, given the information available at the time, was this a reasonable decision, and what probability of success did it actually offer? And then there are the so-called intangibles: chemistry, confidence, leadership, adaptability, composure, baseball IQ. The ability to recognize what a situation requires and act before everyone else has fully processed what is happening. Some of those qualities are becoming more measurable. StatCast can quantify parts of what we once described broadly as instinct or feel: where a fielder was positioned, how quickly he reacted, whether he moved in the correct direction, the route he took, and how much ground he covered. But those measurements cannot fully capture the entire human system. And the fact that something is difficult to quantify does not mean it is imaginary. At the same time, calling something chemistry or grit should not exempt them from examination or allow it to become a convenient explanation for whatever just happened. The leadership challenge is to make the intangible as tangible as the evidence reasonably allows. What behaviors are we actually seeing? How consistently? Under what conditions? What effect do they appear to have on teammates or performance? And what evidence would change our interpretation? The goal is not to choose between data and human judgment. It's to use each to test and improve the other. And sometimes a play comes along that makes the relationship between data, preparation, instinct, and execution almost impossible to separate. 2 recent Dodgers double plays illustrate this beautifully. The first came in Game 6 of the 2025 World Series against the Toronto Blue Jays. The Dodgers were protecting a 3-1 lead in the bottom of the 9th inning and, more importantly, trying to prevent Toronto from winning the World Series on its home field. The Blue Jays had runners on second and third with 1 out when Andres Gimenez hit a broken bat ball into shallow left field. This was not a routine double play ball. It floated into that horrible patch of uncertainty between the infield and the outfield, the kind of ball that makes every runner, fielder, manager, and fan briefly stop breathing. Except Kike Hernandez, who did not appear to hesitate at all. From the crack of the bat, he was coming forward. Part of that was positioning. Kike had deliberately moved in, starting 272 feet from home plate, 26 feet shallower than the average left fielder against a left-handed hitter. With a tying run on second, he wanted to be close enough to keep that runner from scoring if Gimenez hit the single through the left side of the infield. In fact, Kike later said he was playing slightly shallower than the Dodgers' positioning card recommended. The positioning only created the possibility of the play. He still had to read the contact almost immediately, cover 52 feet in 3.4 seconds, make the catch while the ball was still difficult to see in the lights, and transfer it quickly enough to create an out that did not exist when the pitch was thrown. StatCast measured his initial jump at 7.3 feet better than the league average. So yes, the data tells us that Kike was exceptionally well positioned, but it also tells us just how extraordinary his reaction was. If his read had even been slightly slower, he might still have made the catch, but he almost certainly would not have had enough time to complete the second part of the play, because Addison Barger, the runner at second, believed the ball was going to fall. He had moved far enough away from the base that once Kike caught it, the possibility of doubling him off suddenly existed. Kike transferred the ball almost immediately and threw on the run to Miguel Rojas at second. The throw arrived on an awkward in-between hop, so Miggy made his own rapid judgment. Rather than reaching forward and allowing the ball to handcuff him, he planted on the base, let the throw travel, read the hop, and secured it just before Barger returned. Double play, game over, World Series extended to Game 7. What I love about the play is that we can measure parts of it. We can measure Kike's positioning, we can measure his reaction, we can measure the distance he covered and compare his jump with the league average. But the numbers do not replace the baseball intelligence required to produce the play. They help us understand it. The data can tell us that his jump was extraordinary. It cannot create the jump for him. He still had to anticipate the likely outcome, read the ball correctly, commit immediately, make the catch at full speed, control the throw, and trust that Miggy would finish the play. The analysis had already been absorbed. The preparation had already happened. When the moment arrived, Kike was not standing in left field, consciously reviewing a briefing deck on Jimenez's spray tendencies. At least one hopes not. The knowledge had become usable judgment. And that has a direct parallel in intelligence and leadership. The purpose of analysis is not to make someone recite more information at the moment of decision. It is to improve the mental model from which the person recognizes, anticipates, and acts. The second double play, more recently against the Phillies, illustrates something slightly different. Philadelphia had runners on second and third with one out in the bottom of the ninth. The Dodgers were protecting a one-run lead. Brandon Marsh hit a softly spinning ball down the third baseline toward Max Muncy. The runner at third, Justin Crawford, initially hesitated and then broke toward home. Muncy did the first important thing correctly. He secured the baseball. That sounds almost insultingly basic, but the field was wet, the ball was spinning, and none of the cleverness that follows matters if he rushes the play and fails to field it cleanly. Once he had it, Muncy threw home to catcher Dalton Rushing. Rushing chased Crawford back toward third and then flipped the ball to Mookie Betts, who would come over to cover third in the rundown. Mookie chased Crawford as he changed direction toward home again and applied the tag. That should have produced one out while leaving JT Realmuto, who had been the Phillies' runner on second at the start of the play, standing safely at third. Except he had begun retreating toward second base. Mookie had just completed the tag. His attention was naturally on the runner directly in front of him. But from his vantage point, Rushing could see Realmuto retreating and began calling for Mookie to throw to second. Mookie later explained that he had not seen the runner himself. He heard Rush calling too, trusted his teammate's view, turned and fired to Tommy Edman, who applied the tag. A 5-2-6-4 double play. Game over. I would have loved to have seen the entire thing from a bird's eye view because a rundown is almost choreographic. Every defensive player has a job. Someone has to secure the ball, someone has to force the runner into the correct direction, the next player has to be positioned to receive the throw, other fielders have to rotate toward the bases that have been vacated, and everyone has to communicate while multiple runners are making their own decisions and changing the problem in real time. No one player possessed the entire picture. Muncy could see the ball and the runner coming home. Rushing could see the field opening behind Mookie. Mookie was in a position to complete the first tag and make the throw. Edman had moved to the place where the next play might develop. The outcome emerged because each player understood his role, maintained enough situational awareness to recognize when the play changed, and trusted the information coming from the teammate with the best view. And that's not a difficult metaphor to extend to intelligence or leadership. Effective teams do not require every person to see the entire system at every moment. They require a shared understanding of the objective, clarity about individual roles, strong fundamentals, and enough trust for the person with the best information to call the adjustment. Leadership creates the conditions for that coordination. Intelligence helps the team recognize when reality has departed from the expected play, and preparation allows people to adapt without having to stop in the middle of the moment and design the response from scratch. The play was not flawless. The runner's mistake created an opportunity, and Dave Roberts noted that Rushing ideally could have chased Crawford a little bit further back to third, and Mookie didn't necessarily know he was going to have an opportunity to throw the runner out at second. But well-prepared teams are not teams in which everything always unfolds according to plan. They are teams in which the people understand the plan well enough to recognize and exploit the moment when it doesn't. And that is ultimately the challenge at the team level. The model may identify the favorable matchup. The coach may recognize a player's mechanics have changed. The catcher may notice the pitcher's command is beginning to disappear. The medical staff may know that his recovery has been slower than normal. The manager may know he threw 28 pitches the previous evening. And the pitcher may look Dave Roberts directly in the eye and say, "I'm good," which as an intelligence professional, I would classify as single source reporting requiring additional validation. The data matters, the observation matters, the context matters, the fundamentals matter, the trust among the people executing the strategy matters. The difficult part is integrating all of them without treating any single source as the complete answer. Because at the team level, the goal is not to collect the most information, it is to create shared understanding that produces better decisions. And even when the organization does all of that well, choosing the right metric, interpreting it correctly, communicating it clearly, placing everyone where they should be, and making the most defensible decision available, humans still have to execute, and the game still gets a vote. And that brings us to the third level, the game itself, because baseball is not simply a collection of individual players making isolated decisions. It is also an adaptive system. The pitcher studies the hitters study the pitchers. Both know that the other is studying them. The catcher sequences pitches based on the hitter's tendencies, but the hitter may begin recognizing the sequence. And the defense positions itself based on where the batter is most likely to hit the ball, but the batter may change their approach in response. A manager brings in a reliever to create a favorable matchup, which prompts the opposing manager to send up a pinch hitter, which changes the defensive alignment, which may affect the next pitching decision. Every decision changes the conditions surrounding the decision that comes next. And this doesn't just happen in one game. It happens across the league, across all 162 games. So this goes back to the dynamic we saw in Moneyball. An organization identifies a pattern others have undervalued or underevaluated. It designs a strategy to exploit that pattern. The strategy creates an advantage, or at least changes the terms of the problem. Competitors notice, they copy it, they counter it, they identify its limitations, and eventually, yesterday's competitive advantage becomes part of the environment everyone is navigating. The system does not sit still long enough to be solved. That is true in intelligence and in leadership. We are rarely observing passive environments. The people, organizations, competitors, and adversaries we are trying to understand are also learning, deciding, reacting, concealing, and adapting. And the model may even change the behavior it was originally designed to predict, which means strategy cannot be a document that we write once and admire. It has to be a continual process of sensing, interpreting, acting, learning, and adjusting. And outcomes emerge from all of those interactions, not from any single variable acting alone. That word, emerge, matters. In systems theory, emergence refers to outcomes, patterns, or capabilities that arise through the interaction of multiple parts, but cannot be fully understood by examining any one of those parts in isolation. The system produces something that none of its individual components produces alone. A flock of birds can create an intricate formation without a single bird directing the entire pattern. A traffic jam can form without an accident, a road closure, or one spectacularly incompetent driver causing it. And a baseball team can produce a play that no individual player planned from beginning to end. The Dodgers' game-ending rundown against the Phillies was not sitting fully formed inside a spreadsheet before the pitch. No one called a 5-2-6-4 double play from the dugout. The opportunity emerged from the interaction among the wet field, the softly hit ball, the runner's decisions, the defender's positioning, Rushing's view of the field, Mookie's trust in his call, and Edmonds' movement toward second. The runner's mistake mattered, but the mistake alone did not produce a double play. The Dodgers still had to recognize, communicate, and execute. Likewise, Kike Hernandez's World Series play emerged from both preparation and the specific conditions of the moment. His positioning mattered, his anticipation of the contact mattered, his reaction mattered. Barger's read mattered. Miguel Rojas's handling of the throw mattered. Change any one of those pieces by a fraction and the outcome may change completely. That is what complex systems do. Small differences can produce dramatically different results. A ball lands 6 inches further away, a throw takes a slightly worse hop, a player hesitates for half a second, a manager makes the same statistically defensible choice on 2 different nights and receives completely different outcomes. The data can help us understand why. It can help us improve the decision, but it cannot remove the interaction, adaptation, timing, and chance that make the system what it is. And that brings us back to the 3 levels we've explored. At the individual level, Ohtani's framework shows us how to work backward from an ambition to identify the capabilities, habits, and identity that make success more likely. At the team level, modern baseball shows us that more information is not the same thing as more intelligence. Organizations still have to identify what matters, interpret it correctly, and communicate it clearly, and create enough shared understanding for people to act together. And at the systems level, the game reminds us that no amount of preparation gives us complete control. The other side adjusts, the environment changes, people make mistakes. People also do things no model fully anticipated. And sometimes the ball simply takes a strange bounce. That does not make preparation meaningless. It makes preparation honest. The purpose of strategy is not to promise a particular ending. It's to improve our ability to recognize what's happening, make a defensible decision, adapt when the environment changes, and create the best possible conditions for success. Sometimes that produces 103 wins. Sometimes it produces an extraordinary double play. Sometimes it produces a perfectly executed pitch that lands in the seats anyways. And sometimes it produces Freddie Freeman standing at the plate on one bad ankle in the 10th inning of a World Series game with the bases loaded, 2 outs, an entire stadium holding its breath. You could explain the matchup, you can analyze the pitch, you can measure the swing, the exit velocity, the launch angle, the distance the ball traveled, but the numbers will never fully explain what it felt like when the ball left the bat. And that's not an argument against data. It's a reminder of what data is and what it's not. Data can help us to understand the game. It can help us make better decisions within it. It can reveal patterns that intuition misses and discipline stories that feel persuasive but are not supported by evidence. But it cannot replace the humans playing it. It cannot eliminate uncertainty, and it cannot make the ending inevitable. So the key takeaway here is that strategy allows us to control the controllables. It helps us to build the systems that make success more likely, use information well, trust the people who can see what we cannot, and to make the best decision available with the information we have. And then we have to understand that reality still gets a vote. That's true in baseball, it's true in intelligence, it's true in leadership, and it's probably true of virtually every decision in life. We can improve the probabilities, but we can never fully control the outcome. And I would argue that that's the biggest reason that it's hard not to be romantic about baseball or intelligence. Thanks for listening to The Unknown Knowns. If this episode made you think or rethink, share it with a colleague or friend who's ready to level up their tradecraft. Subscribe for more short, sharp conversations about the art and science of professional judgment. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep turning intelligence into impact.